your firelock. Reverse your firelock. Horn on arm. Cover your firelock. Shoulder your firelock.
I'm going to share a story with you guys today, and it's absolutely one of the most untold stories in the whole American Revolution. And when I'm done with this, I'll tell you why it is that it's the most untold. But I'm going to do it as my 6th great-grandfather. So I'm going to do it in first person, and I'm going to paint a picture with words doing this story. I've done it many, many times in many, many places. But if you listen to this story, you'll understand why each and every one of us is free today. My name is Thomas Morgan. I was born up in the Shenandoah Valley. And as a young boy, my pa had moved us down on the Catawba River in North Carolina. And as I grew to be a man, took a family of my own, I'd become quite a hunter. That's how I provided for my family. But game was getting scarce. And like every other man that lived in the colonies, I was under the rule of King George III. That man had become quite a tyrant. He had taxed us so heavily that poor people like me, we couldn't afford to pay our taxes. About 1773, I'd heard of a couple of adventurous men that went across the top of the Blue Ridge Mountain against King George's rules. Because King George promised the Cherokee that nobody would ever cross those mountains. But I'd heard of a couple of men like William Bean, James Robinson, that went over to the Cherokee territory hunting. And they come back with tails of game that was so thick you could hunt all day long. The ground was so fertile you could drop a grain of corn and it would grow right where you dropped it. Well, by 1774, I had heard that people had started going over the mountain, leasing land from the Cherokee, making treaties with them, and settling on the other side of the Blue Ridge. Now, I got to tell you, that really appealed to me. Knowing that I could hunt, provide for my family. So, in late 1774, I packed up my wife, the youngins, what we could carry on horseback, and I headed over the mountain. We come riding down into the Watauga Valley, and sure enough, people had started settling. I heard about a man named Jacob Brown that had leased a lot of land from the Cherokee, and he'd opened a trading post down on the Noachucky River. Went down and met the gentleman, and we got a fine piece of land down on the river. We worked day and night building our cabin, clearing land, planting our crops. And you know, for the first time in my life, I was completely free. I wasn't under the rule of King George anymore. I was sitting on the edge of the world and I was completely free. But like every other man that crossed those mountains, I joined the militia. I served under Colonel John Sevier, Nolan Chucky Jack's what we called him. And they'd call us up to raise barns, to clear roads, to protect the settlement from any hostile raid. And things was good for quite a while. But then a man by the name of Richard Henderson, he wanted to buy a fine piece of land from the Cherokee, become governor and sell it, make a profit. He called for a treaty at Sycamore Shoals, so I went up to see what it was about. Man, I never seen so many Cherokee in one place in my life. They sold him a fine piece of land that later became Kentucky. But one warrior by the name of Dragon Canoe, he protested the settlement of any land. And he told Henderson, we sold you a fine piece of land, but from this day, it will be dark and bloody. After that, Dragon Canoe formed his own band of Cherokee, and his main mission was to push all those settlers back over the mountain. By 1776, they had laid us under siege in Fort Watauga, held up there for 2 weeks, but they couldn't take us. They finally gave up. 1777 was even worse. Seems like we was fighting every month to hang on to what we had. But by that time, the news had come to us that a man by the name of George Washington had raised a Continental Army and took a stand against the British up north. But I got to tell you folks, that war seemed a lifetime away from us. We were on the edge of the frontier, and we were fighting constantly to hang on to what we had. We didn't think that war would affect us, but we were wrong. By 1780, King George was getting real tired of this revolution. It was costing him a fortune. So Sir Henry Clinton, the overall commander of all the British forces in the colonies, he came up with a plan. He called it his Southern Strategy. He loaded troops on a ship, all their supplies, they sailed down the East Coast. They took Savannah. They came up, laid siege to Charleston, the biggest ports in the South. The Continental Army that was there under Benjamin Lincoln just surrendered. Not even much of a fight. Now the British plan was to come south because they figured there were more Americans that was still loyal to King George in the South. They were going to raise this army of loyalists, train them in the British coat of arms, and march them north across the Carolinas, catch George Washington between these two armies, and put an end to this revolution. Now, seeing that his plan was working, Sir Henry Clinton sailed back to New York, and he left in charge of the Southern forces Lord Major Charles Cornwallis. Now, Cornwallis had two commanders serving under him. One by the name of Bannister Tarleton. He led the British Dragoons. He was a savage man. The other one was a man by the name of Major Patrick Ferguson. Now, Ferguson's job was to protect Cornwallis' western flank, to raise this army of loyalist Americans just like us, train them, and then march them north. Well, his plan was working really good. He was raising quite an army. But we had heard about a few patriot leaders on this side of the Blue Ridge, men like Charles and Joseph McDowell, the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, Elijah Clark. They had took a stand against the British. They were taking their militia, and every time the British wasn't expecting it, they'd come pouring out of the woods and lay into them, and then disappear back in the mountains. Well, some of the men from on the other side of the mountain over in the settlements, they started coming over and joining them to help fight for the cause. Well, Ferguson's army was camped at a place called Musgrove Mills. And there was a band of screaming frontiersmen come out of the woods and laid into them and inflicted heavy casualties, and then disappeared right back in the mountains. Ferguson had enough. He had captured a young man by the name of Samuel Phillips, and he sent him over the mountain with a message for all of us over mountain men. They started calling us. And this is the message that he sent us. He said, you lay down your arms. You pledge loyalty to King George, or I will march my army over the mountain. I will lay waste your homes and crops with fire and sword, and I'll hang your leaders. He made a mistake. I was behind my cabin laying up wood for the winter. My neighbor come riding up and said, get your rifle, get your horse. They're calling up the militia. I said, why? We ain't had trouble with the Cherokee in a long time. They said, no, it ain't the Cherokee, it's the British. He told me about this threat. My blood was boiling. I went to the cabin, got my rifle, some provisions, saddled my horse. And as we come riding up the Novachucky River toward Colonel Severe's place, they were men coming out of every holler. We were swarming like yellow jackets. Everybody was mad. By the time we got to the colonel's place, there was 240 of us. Now, the message had come to Colonel Isaac Shelby from Ferguson, and we didn't know it, but Colonel Shelby had raised 240 men. He was the one that sent the message to Colonel Severe. So we started riding to Fort Watauga because they had already agreed that's where we'd all meet. We cut up Cherokee Creek, come right into Fort Watauga, and Colonel Shelby was there with 240 men from the Holston settlements. Now, when we got there, we found out that a few weeks earlier, when that threat came over, they went up into Southwest Virginia talking to Colonel William Campbell, asking him for help, and first he told them no. And they told him, if Ferguson brings his army over this mountain, we're not strong enough to stop him. So we had been to Fort Watauga for just about an hour, and here come Colonel William Campbell riding across the Watauga with 200 Virginians. A few hours later, his cousin Arthur Campbell come riding across the river with 200 more Virginians. And as we camped on the banks of the Watauga River that night, there were campfires as far as your eye could see. None of us really knew what was going to happen, but we knew something was going to happen. The commanders got together that night, and they made a decision. They said, Ferguson, he's wanting to fight. Well, let's give him one. But we're not going to let him come over here. We're not going to fight him around our homes and our family. We'll take it to him. Now, the next morning, we were getting ready to leave. There was a young lady by the name of Miss Mary Patton. She made some of the finest gunpowder you could ever hope to get your hands on. She come into the fort with 500 pounds of some of the fastest burning powder you could ever hope to get. Gave it to us, and it was quite a gift. Because I don't know if you folks realize, you could actually buy an acre of land cheaper than you get a pound of powder. So that was some gift. Now, when we was getting ready to saddle up and leave, there was a young Presbyterian minister stood up, and he gave us a sermon and a prayer. His name was Reverend Samuel Doak, and I'd like for you to hear the sermon and prayer that he gave us.
My countrymen, you're about to set out on an expedition which is full of hardships and dangers, but one in which the Almighty will attend you. The mother country has her hands upon you, these American colonies, and takes that for which our fathers planted their homes in the wilderness. Our liberty! Taxation without representation and the quartering of soldiers in the home of our people without their consent are evidence that the Crown of England would take from the American subjects the last vestige of freedom. Your brethren across the mountains are crying. They're crying for Macedonia unto you for help. God forbid that you shall refuse to hear and answer their call. But the call of your brethren is not all. The enemy is marching hither to destroy your homes. Brave men, you may not, you are not unacquainted with battle. Your hands have already been taught to war and your fingers to fight. You have wrested these beautiful valleys of the Holston and Watauga from the savage hand. Will you tarry now until the other enemy carries fire and sword to your very doors? No, it shall not be. Go forth then in the strength of your manhood to the aid of your brethren, the defense of the aid of your brethren, the defense of your liberty, and the protection of your home. And may the God of justice be with you and give you victory. Let us pray. Almighty and gracious God, thou hast been the refuge and strength of thy people in all ages. In time of sorest need, we have learned to come to thee. Our rock and our fortress, thou knowest the dangers and snares that surround us on march and in battle. Thou knowest the dangers that constantly threaten the humble, but well-beloved homes which thy servants have left behind. Oh, in thine infinite mercy, save us from the cruel hand of the savage and of the tyrant. Save the unprotected homes while fathers and husbands and sons are far away fighting for freedom and helping the oppressed. Thou, who promised to protect the sparrow in its flight, keep ceaseless watch by day and by night over our loved ones, the helpless woman and little children. We commit to thy care. Thou wilt not leave them or forsake them in times of loneliness and anxiety and terror. O God of battle, arise in thy might, avenge the slaughter of thy people, confound those who plot for our destruction, crown this mighty effort with victory, and smite those who exalt themselves against liberty and justice and truth. Help us as good soldiers to wield the sword of the Lord and Gideon. Amen.
The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. That became one of our battle cries. We saddled up that morning, rode out from Fort Watauga, and it began to rain. We were driving a few cattle with us for provisions. Got to the bottom of the mountain, place that the old folks call the resting place. We called it the Shelving Rock. It was a big rock overhang, and the rain had increased. We put all of our powder under that rock overhang at night to try to keep it dry, and laid out in the field in our blankets in the rain. We got up the next morning and realized that we could not drive the cattle over the mountain. It would slow us down. So we slaughtered what we could carry, sent the rest back to the fort with some boys. We headed straight up the mountain where the trail crossed over, a place called the Yellow Mountain Gap. You know, by the time we got to the top of the mountain, the rain had stopped because it had turned to snow. We camped on top of the mountain that night. It's the most miserable night I can remember in my life. The wind was howling, the snow was blowing. Woke up the next morning, and I remember looking across the Watauga Valley. I could still see some of the smoke from the settlements, from the fires. And I was sitting there wondering, will I ever see my family again? Because we all knew basically we was leaving our families unprotected. You know, I had rode on many campaigns with Colonel Sevier against the Cherokee, but this was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. Because we all knew that we was riding against the most powerful army in the world, and we knew our chances were slim. We done a little drilling that morning on top of the mountain, took a roll call, and two of Colonel Severe's men were missing, a man by the name of Chambers and Crawford. Now, Chambers I knew, Crawford I didn't. I never trusted that man. He was kind of like a chicken killing dog. He was sneaky. And we figured that these men had rode ahead of us to warn Ferguson that this over-mountain army was on its way, and that's exactly what they did. But on the other side of Yellow Mountain, we run into a problem, because they were two trails that come off the mountain down to the Piedmont. And we knew good and well that if we took one trail, Ferguson might be marching his army up the other, and he'd march straight into the settlements, and we couldn't stop him. The last we had heard of Ferguson, he was at the bottom of the mountain. He had defeated Colonel McDowell at Cane Creek a little bit earlier. And McDowell and his men was at Fort Patara riding with us, coming back over the mountain. So the commanders got together and made a decision. They done something that's seldom done. They split our forces. Colonel Campbell took all the boys from Virginia and took one trail. Colonel Shelby and Severe took the rest of us. We took the other trail and we come off the mountain. No sign of Ferguson. We come riding into a little plantation, a place called Quaker Meadows. It was owned by one of our Patriot leaders, Colonel Charles McDowell. We come riding in there in the pouring rain. And the McDowells, they were so gracious to us. They let us take the top rail off the fence, burning our fires trying to dry out in the rain. Brought in a little corn, a little more beef. They was trying to feed us the best they could. And as we sat there that evening in the pouring rain, well, here come a whole group of men riding in from Surrey County, North Carolina, 380 some. They were being led by Major Winston and a great big man named Colonel Benjamin Cleveland. Now, I'd heard of old Ben Cleveland. That man was notorious for hanging loyalists. If you was loyal to King George, you run into old Ben Cleveland, last sound you'd hear would be your neck snapped at the end of the rope. That old man hanging. I kind of liked him. Our army was growing. And as we sat there in the pouring rain, some scouts came in. They found Ferguson. He was camped just a few days' ride from us at a place called Gilberttown. Now, next morning, we got up and all our commanders had met under a big oak tree. You see, we were all militia, and each militia had its own colonel. Well, we had more colonels than ear of corn. But the only colonel we had wasn't from the Carolina, was Colonel William Campbell from Virginia. So they had voted him our overall commander. We took to the saddle that morning and went thundering across the Catawba River. We was headed straight for Ferguson. We're going to put an end to this threat. We got about a day and a half ride from Gilberttown, and the sky opened up on us. It began to pour down the rain. So we squatted under a group of cedar trees, trying to keep our rifles and our powder dry, praying for the rain to stop, but it didn't let up, so we pushed on. We got right outside of Gilberttown, tied our horses up into the tree lines. We took our long rifles and we moved in on foot. We went screaming out in that field where old Ferguson was at, and he was gone. He'd been gone for 2 days. There was nothing there but cold campfires. And it had rained so much that the ground was like a swamp. We couldn't even find his trail. But one of our commanders, a man by the name of Williams from South Carolina, he said, well, Ferguson's riding south. He's headed to that big old British fort, Fort 96. So we turned and we started riding in that direction because we had to catch him. Now, the next night we was camped down on the Green River. In the middle of the night, I never heard such a commotion. Man come riding through our camp. Some of the boys drug him out of the saddle. They was going to hang him. Thought he was a spy. He said, my name's Colonel Edward Lacey. Take me to see the commanders. So we drug him up to see Colonel Campbell, and sure enough, he knew him. And Colonel Lacey asked him, so where are you going? He said, we're riding toward Fort 96. We got to catch Patrick Ferguson. He said, well, I don't know where you got your information, but you're riding the wrong way. Ferguson ain't headed to Fort 96. He's headed to Charlottetown to get reinforcements from Cornwallis. And now we all got scared. Because we knew good and well if he got reinforcements, none of us would ever cross the mountains again. We had rode straight to our death. Now Lacey, he had a group of Patriot fighters camped a few miles from us, and he agreed to meet us the next day at a place in South Carolina called the Cow Pens. We got up that morning and we rode 29 miles in the pouring rain. We come riding into the Cow Pens. Lacey and his men was already there. Now, the Cow Pens was owned by a wealthy loyalist. He'd buy up all the cattle in that area and graze them on that good grass, and then he'd pay men to drive them north to Philadelphia and sell them. We come riding in there and we hadn't had a bite to eat since we left Quaker Meadows. And I can honestly say that all the men from the settlement that I rode with, none of us were a thief. But I also remember hearing the Reverend Doak say one time, the Lord helps those that help herself. So that's what we did. We helped ourselves that man's beef. We didn't think he'd care a whole lot because we was all starved to death. And every one of us had a rifle. And that was the best meal we'd had in days. And as we sat there that evening in the pouring rain, once again the commanders got together and they made a decision. They come walking through our camps that afternoon and they started picking out 900 of the best men. And they picked out 900 of the best horses that we hadn't rode into the ground chasing Ferguson. And I'll never forget it. At 9 o'clock at night, we took to the saddle. We rode off in the dark, in the pouring rain, looking for Ferguson. All night long we pushed through the darkness. Couldn't even see the horse in front of him. We wouldn't let up. We knew this was our only chance. We would never have an army like this again. We crossed the Broad River in the middle of the night. It's completely flooded. Put our strongest horses downstream in case any of the men washed out of the saddle. There was nothing going to stop us. Now the next morning, we rode up on a little settlement, a little homestead. We had a young man traveling with us. His name was Enoch Gilman. Little Enoch rode up to the commanders. He said, I got an idea. You let me ride over there to that house. I'll find out where Ferguson's at. So we all laid back in the woods. Little Enoch rode across the field, tied his horse off, walked up and knocked on the door, and there were 2 women living there. Little Enoch looked as mean as he could. He said, I'm looking for Patrick Ferguson. I want to join his army. The lady said, well, I know exactly where he's at because we took him eggs. He's on Kings Mountain. Now, some of the boys give Enoch just about enough time. They figure he found out what we needed. They busted in that house, grabbed little old Enoch, and they was going to hang him as a traitor. And then women commenced to squall, well, don't hang him, he's just a boy. So one of the men spoke up and said, well, not to offend these lovely ladies, let's take him down the road and hang him. So they drug Enoch out of the house where the women couldn't see him. The commanders called him up. Said, Enoch, did you find Ferguson? He said, yeah, he's on Kings Mountain. So now we knew. We knew exactly where he was at, and we was riding harder than we ever ridden because his threat was going to end, and it was going to end today. Right about noon, while the boys were starting to wear down, they wanted to stop and rest. And Colonel Isaac Shelby from the Holston, he come riding right through our lines. He said, rest? I will not rest until I ride through the lines of Cornwallis himself. He fired us up and we kept riding. Now right before 3 o'clock, by the grace of God, the rain had stopped. And we were at the bottom of Kings Mountain. Colonel Campbell took all the boys from Virginia to the front of that little old mountain. Colonel Shelby took the boys from the Holston settlement, went around this side. Colonel Cleveland, Lacey, other commanders took the back. Colonel Sevier took all us boys from the Watauga, and we went around this side of the mountain. We had him. He wasn't going anywhere. We hit that mountain the first time, and they pushed us back. We hit the mountain the second time, we went a little further, but once again they pushed us back. But the third time we hit that little mountain, we went almost to the top. We was so close on them, some of our boys was fighting with their knives and tomahawks against their bayonets. You know, a lot of us older men remember when we went over the mountain and settled and we was having trouble with the Cherokee. When they had attacked the settlements, they'd come screaming out of the woods. It would make your hair stand up. It would make your skin crawl. So as we hit that mountain the third time, we were screaming our heads off just like the Cherokee. As a matter of fact, the British started calling us the Yelling Boys. But not only were we screaming like the Cherokee, we were fighting like the Cherokee because we had learned very well. We was hiding behind the trees and rocks. We'd step out the fire and step back in and reload. And like I said, we went almost to the top. And there was Ferguson. He was on a big white horse. He had his saber in one hand, 2 silver whistles, while he was riding back and forward on that little mountain that day, blowing those whistles and barking out commands to his men. A lot of his boys seen it, but he's overrun them. They'd raise up a white flag and Ferguson come riding by and cut it down. Now to this day, I can't tell you if Ferguson was trying to escape. I can't tell you if he was trying to rally his men. But what I can tell you for a fact is he got too far on the south side of that little mountain that day, and he ran smack into John Sevier and us boys in the Watauga. I was standing behind a big white oak tree every time I stick my head around and shoot the bark and fly off of it. I could hear all the lead rifle balls whistling past me. The air was completely full of gun smoke. We couldn't even see who we was shooting at, but we wouldn't let up shooting. There was a young man right over from me that day. John Gilliland was his name. Little old John had been wounded 3 times. He was still at the top of the mountain. I heard him say, "Here comes Ferguson." He raised his rifle. He took a real careful aim. And when he pulled the trigger, it went click. It misfired. But there was an older gentleman right over from him that day. Everybody in the settlements knew this man. Robert Young was his name. Robert was 62 years old. Now, for you folks that don't know, Robert had named his rifle after his wife Mary. But he didn't call his rifle Mary, he called it Sweet Lips, because that's what he called Mary. I seen old Robert raise that rifle. He took a real careful aim. And I heard him say, "We'll see what Sweet Lips can do." And when he pulled that trigger, Ferguson came right out of the saddle. But his horse moved. And his foot was hung in the stirrup. You know, by the time the boys got his horse stopped, he had 8 more holes through him. Ferguson told his men when he got to King's Mountain, he said, "God Almighty and his angels won't take me off this mountain." He didn't realize how right he was, because that's where we left him. Every man that was fighting with Ferguson that day was killed or captured. And they were 28 patriots that never seen the sunset. We camped at the bottom of that little old mountain that night, and I gotta tell you folks, to this day, I can hear the sounds of the wounded and the dying. We started marching the prisoners north toward the Yadkin River. A few days later, we sent some boys marching them on, and the rest of us cut and headed back over the mountain. You know, it took about a week for old Cornwallis to find out we whipped Ferguson so bad. But when he found out, he turned tail and he ran like a scalded dog. He had no idea where this band of rabble, he called us, this Over Mountain Army, was at. As a matter of fact, the last we heard of Cornwallis, old Nathaniel Green and Dan Morgan was running him ragged all over the mountains, and he was headed back toward the coast. But us Over Mountain men, we went back over the mountain. We went over there to raise our crops, to raise our families. And we didn't know it at the time, but one of the most important seeds we ever planted was that day on that little mountain. Because with an hour and 5 minutes, we planted a seed of freedom. Because what we did that day, if you think about it, it was nothing short of a miracle. Because there was a band of 900 starved, exhausted, hunters and farmers volunteered to the last man. We stopped and we forced the retreat of the most powerful army in the world. and then we went home. Now, this story that I just shared with you, I didn't get all the details because we would be here too long. But it's a true story. You can look it up. None of it's made up. And I'm sure, like Andrea said, that most of you folks had ancestors that was either in that battle or other ones in this area. In 1974, there was a couple of guys said, I got an idea. Let's follow the trail that the Over Mountain men took to Kings Mountain. So they commenced walking. And they walked all the way from Fort Watauga to Kings Mountain, South Carolina. The next year they were joined by more. Next year they were joined by more. And this went on year after year. And they go through the communities. And folks got to wondering about these people dressed funny, carrying long rifles. They started coming and hanging out with them, bringing fried chicken, potato salad, find out what these people was about. And then he started walking with them. So year after year this went on, more and more people. In 1980, Senator James Broyhill took it to Congress. President Jimmy Carter signed it into law. And it became a national historic trail, just like the Lewis and Clark Trail, the Santa Fe Trail. And every year since then, they've been a group of reenactors that followed that trail to Kings Mountain. Now, Andrea, she's one of the ones that walked. I used to walk when I was able, as much as I could. But 2006 is when I joined. This will be my 19th march to Kings Mountain coming up. And I think 19th, I can't remember. Lost track. But anyways, 2006, we was sitting around one evening and we was talking. And I told some of the boys, I said, you know, we're getting old and fat, too old to walk. We need to start talking more. So we started telling the story. 2006, we shared the story to 3,400 fourth graders. Every year, we done more and more classes, all the way down the trail. Go to schools, schools come out where we is at. The year before they shut the world down with COVID, we told this story to 17,000 kids in almost 3 weeks. Our motto, the Over Mountain Victory Trail, is keeping the story alive. And when I started this story, I told you it's the most untold story. Well, it is. They don't teach it very much, but we do. And the reason it's one of the most untold stories is because it wasn't a Continental Army that defeated Ferguson. It was a group of volunteer frontiersmen. So they don't want that told too much. If you read a book, a school book, it might be half a paragraph about Kings Mountain. And you heard Andrea say that I went to Philadelphia, the opening of the museum. I did. I've done this program at the governor's dinner. And at the museum, they had a professor giving a lecture on Concord and Lexington and Saratoga. He said that Saratoga was the turning point of the whole revolution. So I let him finish because I didn't want to be rude like I normally am. We got to talking. He said, don't you think Saratoga was the turning point? I said, it was a turning point, not the turning point. He said, what do you consider the turning point? I said, Kings Mountain. He said, how do you figure it? I said, it's common sense, man. I said, you guys fought the British up here for 5 years. You couldn't whip them. They came south and we run them completely out in a year and 12 days. Now tell me where the turning points were at. There were more battles fought in South Carolina than the whole 13 colonies put together. People don't realize it. This history, this story that I just shared with you, it happened in most of his backyard, this whole area. Now, I would like to invite you guys this year for the annual march. It's a very special year for us. It's our 50th march for the Over Mountain Victory Trail to Kings Mountain. And I'd like to invite each and every one of you to come out and be with us. You don't have to march with us. You don't even have to dress pretty like us. You can come out and hang out with us. You can find us online. We'll have our schedule on there before the march starts, tell you where we're at, what we're doing every day, all the way down the trail. You can find us at ovta.org or on Facebook. And I'd like to invite each and every one of you to come out and be with us. Now, since I finished this story, if you don't mind, I'm gonna share just one more little story. And this is kind of my testimony. And then I'll make it real short, I promise. Because when I was a young'un, I was raised by an old Cherokee guy. I used to ask him a question, he'd never answer me. He'd always tell me a story. But in that story was the answer to my question. But a little over 6 years ago, I was dying. Stage 4 cancer. They told me I had 2 weeks to live. I had 720 hours of chemo. And the church up next to the house, they had a benefit for me. So when I got able, I went to church. Everybody there knew me. They knew I was a storyteller. And the preacher asked me if I'd share a story. I said, I absolutely will. And I said, this story may not even be appropriate to tell in church, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I said, because if you listen to this story, it'll tell you how strong your faith is. He said, well, go ahead and tell it. I said, all right. I said, there was this old Indian guy. He won the lottery. Just tons of money. And he thought, I'm going to buy me a car. So he bought him a big Cadillac. And then he thought, well, I'm going to find me a woman. So I got to go to the city. Better buy me some alcohol. So he filled the back seat full of booze. Throwed all of his money in the back seat of his car, and he started over the mountains to the city to find him a woman. And as he started down the other side of the mountain, his brakes went out. His car went through the guardrail and over a cliff. And as it went over, he jumped out and he grabbed a tree limb on the side of that cliff. His car, his money, his booze, everything went there and just blew up. And he's hanging in the dark on this limb. So he starts praying. He said, God, help me. Nothing. He hears that limb crack. He starts praying a little harder. God, please help me. He hears a voice. Says, you believe in me, son? Yes, God, I believe in you. He said, do you have faith in me? Yes, God, I have faith in you. He said, let go of that limb. He kept holding on. He said, can somebody else help him? And I told him, I said, the reason I shared this story with you, just a few months ago, I was laying in bed dying. I was hanging on that limb. My whole world, everything I knew was fixing to be gone. My wife, my kids. I was hanging on that limb. He said, let go. And I did. If you think about this story every day, if you're the one hanging on that limb and the Lord says, let go, is your faith strong enough to do it? Well, I'm standing here and I am proof that if you trust your faith and He tells you to let go, you won't only fly, you will soar. I hope you folks enjoyed this story. So I'm gonna finish up because I'm getting long-winded like a Baptist preacher, which is up my neck of the woods. But if you got any questions, me and Dalton will be over here mingling around, probably eating something later. And we'll be glad to answer any questions you have. But like I said, I'd like to invite you to come out, be on the march with us this year, because it's a very important year. And the story I just shared with you is just a small portion of the sacrifice that's been made so we can sit here and be free today. Thank you.